1814, South Carolina. The macabre mystery of the 7 guests who woke in coffins at Ashwood Estate. There was no sound in the coffin but the slow, hot trickle of soil seeping through the cracks. It pressed into the spaces between her fingers, wormed past her lips as she screamed, and settled into the hollows of her eyes with the quiet certainty of something that had done this before. She had no name, no memory, no face, only panic, breath, and darkness. She tried to move her legs, but they were pinned, not bound, not broken, just wrong, like they had never belonged to her at all. She clawed at the wood. It felt damp, old, warped in places where time had tried to eat it and failed. Her fingernails struck something harder than wood, a hinge, then a clasp, then the brittle shell of something alive once, long ago. Teeth, not hers. She didn't scream again. She couldn't. The air was thick with rot and memory, and before she could choke on either, the coffin cracked. The first time they found her, she was naked, soaked in dirt, and curled like an embryo in the middle of the Ashwood family parlor. The fire was lit. The hearth was swept clean. The grandfather. Clock ticked as if it had never stopped. And no one remembered letting her in. That was June of 1814. South Carolina was thick with rain that season, and the Spanish moss hung lower than usual. The Ashwood Estate stood 2 miles inland from the coast, perched high on a soft ridge that once overlooked rice fields and tobacco rows, but now offered only a view of the surrounding pine barrens, tangled like knuckles, clawing back what had been stolen by the war. Ashwood had once been a place of grief, then of celebration, then silence. Built in 1770 by the plantation patriarch Elias Ashwood, it had weathered fire, debt, and the slow decay of a name that once held weight among Southern aristocracy. By 1814, it had become something else entirely, a retreat, a convalescent sanctuary, according to local gossip, where the unwell or unwanted members of rich families were quietly sent to recover, retreat, or simply disappear. Its guest book was never shown. Its owner, Miss Lucinda Ashwood, was said to be a woman of fierce composure and refined habits, an unmarried spinster who kept no husband, no staff, and no chapel. She was seen twice a month in Charleston, once at the apothecary and once at the port. No one ever saw her eat. Her face, according to town accounts, was always pale but unblemished, as though death itself had offered her a kind of respectful distance. She was also the one who found the first girl, and the second, and the third. The guests never came through the front door. They were never announced. They simply appeared. Sometimes in the dining hall, sometimes in the cellar, and once, in a moment that no one would ever confess to having seen, in the room that had once been Elias Ashwood's study. But what connected them wasn't just their nakedness. It wasn't just their silence. It wasn't even the peculiar state of their skin, pale, veined with dirt, and etched with strange red indentations that looked too shallow to be wounds and too precise to be accidents. It was the panic in their eyes, the scratching behind their teeth, the way they all looked at their hands like they weren't quite their own. The locals whispered. Of course they did. Rumors clung to the estate like moss. Tales of yellow fever, grave robbers, coastal disappearances, and slaves buried alive before the Emancipation had ever been written. But what troubled the old women most, what sent them home to light candles and whisper over coffee tins filled with bone and clove, was the fact that not one of the 7 guests ever gave the same name twice. Not to Lucinda, not to the doctors, not to each other. One swore she was Annabel Ross, missing since 1809. Another insisted she was a sailor from Savannah named Elijah. A third, barely 16, claimed to be her own mother, though her accent belonged to New York. They changed with the weeks, and when they did, their handwriting changed too. But none of them remembered the coffin. That was Miss Lucinda's private knowledge, not shared, not recorded, not even whispered to the clergy who still passed once a month to offer rites. She kept it to herself because she had found the first one. And when she did, it wasn't empty. It was already cracked open. There had been blood in the hinges. Old, rust-colored streaks of it dried along the edges, just enough to suggest a hand had forced its way out or in, and there were claw marks, but not frantic ones. No, they were neat, rhythmic, as if made by someone tracing a pattern they'd already memorized. The local physician, Dr. Halcombe, made 2 visits to the estate that year. The first time, he diagnosed the girl as having suffered from catalepsy brought on by trauma and perhaps fever. The second time, he refused to cross the threshold. Something in the way the girl stared at him, something too knowing, left him shaken. By October, 3 more guests had arrived, each one less vocal than the last. By winter, Lucinda had taken to burning the bedding after each appearance. She said it was for sanitation, but the real reason was far stranger. The linens came back stained with salt. Not blood, not soil, but salt water, wet to the touch. Even when no bath had been drawn, and all of them smelled faintly of turned earth, like graves that had been dug, too shallow, too recently. By the end of that year, the servants stopped coming. Not because they were dismissed, not because they were unpaid. They simply never returned. And Lucinda Ashwood, pale and precise, continued to order linens, candles. Ink, salt, always salt. The 7th guest arrived on the night of the first frost, and she didn't speak at all. She only wrote one thing on the parlor wall before she disappeared the next morning. It said, "You buried me, but I didn't die. You gave me a name that wasn't mine. Now I've given it back." The handwriting was unlike any the household had ever seen, but Lucinda recognized it because it was her own. There was something wrong with the names. Lucinda Ashwood knew it before the second frost arrived. She kept the guest book sealed, wrapped in linen and wax, not out of privacy, but necessity. Because when she opened it, even alone, even in the safety of her own study with every door bolted, her hands would tremble. It was not the handwriting that frightened her. It was the repetition, the patterns. Names from decades ago, names of cousins long dead. Names that had only ever been whispered in family prayers or scribbled in ledger margins. Names that had never been told to a soul outside the Ashwood bloodline. And now here they were, scrawled by strangers with dirt still beneath their nails. Some used ink. Others carved it with a dry finger across the wooden bed frames or floorboards or, most often, the mirror. Always backwards, always left-handed, always legible when seen in reverse. Lucinda began to suspect something crueler than madness. Something deeper than haunting, not ghostly, not divine, but human in the way knives are human, made with purpose, guided by trembling hands, and always sharpest when used without emotion. The 7th guest, who called herself Edith, one day and Josephine the next, refused to sleep indoors. Lucinda found her each morning in the woodshed behind the stables, curled beneath the old horse blanket, pressed into the hay as though she expected the ceiling to collapse and bury her properly. She never spoke, only listened. And when she blinked, her lashes dropped slow like someone trying to wake up from a memory she didn't consent to. Lucinda sent a letter to Dr. Halcombe. He did not reply. 2 days later, his apprentice delivered a note on his behalf. The soul's boundaries are no longer fixed. Close the house. No signature. No return address. By Christmas, the mirrors began to resist cleaning. No matter how Lucinda wiped, the edges stayed clouded, as though the glass itself remembered something it refused to surrender. And then came the first of the scrapings. Low, subtle, like a spoon dragged gently across porcelain. It echoed from beneath the floorboards, always at night, always beneath whichever room the newest guest slept in. Lucinda followed the sound once, barefoot and breathless, down into the ash-dusted cellar. She brought no lantern, only salt. She sprinkled it at the base of each beam, tracing a ring around the foundation. She whispered the names she remembered, her grandmother's, her aunt's, her own sisters, and told the shadows below that the Ashwoods were still watching. The sound stopped for 3 nights. On the 4th, the girl named Edith Josephine woke screaming. Her fingernails had blackened, her tongue was torn. There were marks on her wrists, faint and thin, like she'd been kissed by rope that was no longer there. But most unsettling of all was the ink, not on her skin, on the floor beside her. A full sentence, scrawled in precise cursive. You forgot. The 9th name, Lucinda. You always forget the 9th. She had no memory of writing it. None of them ever did. Lucinda burned that room, not in panic, in ritual. She tore down the drapes, unhooked the mirror, poured a half-gallon of whiskey across the floor, and lit the flame herself. No one came to stop her. Not the law, not the neighbors. The estate stood too far from the main road, and her only surviving relative, an aging uncle in Beaufort, had gone half-blind from grief years ago. No one saw the smoke, but the soil did. It shifted, and by spring, the roots in the garden grew sideways, not down. The vines along the porch curled inward, wrapping tight against the shutters like arms pulling something close. And inside the guest rooms, where no one had slept for weeks, the bed sheets wrinkled each morning as though bodies had tossed and turned all night in dreams too heavy to name. Lucinda found another name etched into her own mirror. It wasn't written. It was breathed. A fogged imprint on the glass. Still warm. She wiped it. It came back the next day, the 9th name. Not a person, a place, a part of the estate that had been sealed since Elias Ashwood died. The root cellar, the one beneath the old chapel. She hadn't gone there in 30 years. She would go now, because the 7th guest had vanished. No footprints, no door opened, no blood, only her voice, caught in the wind just before dawn, whispering Lucinda's full name, Lucinda Mercy Ashwood, and asking softly, "Do you remember what you did?" The path to the chapel had long since grown over, but Lucinda still knew it by heart. She had walked it once as a child in a white dress, holding her sister's hand, the hem caked with red clay. Then again at 19, when she laid her father beneath the floorboards in an empty coffin he never saw. And once more, much later, under moonlight, when the only thing colder than the wind was the iron key she carried pressed to her chest. She hadn't returned since the fire, but now the 9th name would not let her rest. She stepped through the waist-high grass, watching for the uneven stones that jutted from the path like teeth. The chapel sat at the edge of the estate, an old timber building swallowed in vine and shadow, its steeple long snapped by wind or judgment. The front doors were swollen with rain and time. She pushed, and they groaned, not from rust, but from something deeper, as if the building exhaled at her return. Inside, the chapel was hollow. The pews had long collapsed into heaps of splintered oak. The pulpit still stood, barely. The air was thick with the smell of damp linen and salt, not from the sea, but from something once salted for burial. At the rear of the chapel was the root cellar door. Lucinda knelt before it, brushed away the dust, and reached for the rusted handle. Her hand hesitated. A memory came, sudden and unwelcome. Her mother leaning down, whispering, "The dead don't lie, Lucy. They wait." She pulled the door open. Below, the earth was black, not from darkness, from something far older. The stairs moaned beneath her weight. She counted each one aloud, steady like a prayer. 9 steps, 9 names, 9 coffins. The cellar walls were lined with old prayer flags and water-stained catechism pages nailed in uneven rows, their ink faded by mildew. But the floor, God help her, the floor was where it changed. 7 wooden boxes, identical, untouched, except each had a name, painted in white chalk. Names she hadn't spoken since she was 12, names of cousins who had left after visits, names of neighbors who'd stayed just one night, and names of guests who had most certainly, absolutely, never. Come, but their coffins were here, already waiting. The 8th coffin was different, smaller, slightly ajar. She crouched, reached. Inside, nothing, except for linen, a neatly folded guest sheet, and beneath it, hair, still braided, still damp, still warm. Lucinda fell back. Her breath stopped just long enough for the room to grow loud with something else. A hum, a murmur, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, but not hers. From the shadows behind the altar, something stirred. Not a shape, not a person, but the outline of a space that had forgotten to be empty. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with memory. Lucinda remembered the guests who'd vanished, each of them, but their faces were wrong, because in her mind's eye, they were all the same. Every one of them. Same mouth, same eyes, same breathless, grateful weeping. The same question. Do you love me enough to stay? And she had always said yes. She had kissed them, fed them, undressed them, buried them, and they had thanked her for it. She never remembered doing it, but they always remembered her. That was the catechism. Not a prayer, not a ritual, a cycle. The house chose, the cellar prepared. The guests arrived, Lucinda forgot, and the coffins waited. Always 9. But now, for the first time in decades, all 9 were open, none of them empty. By the time Lucinda staggered back into the hall, the portraits had changed. She had grown used to their eyes. The old men with drawn mouths, the stiff women with their lace collars, all the proud ancestors of Ashwood who had owned land and debt and wives like so many crumbling deeds. But now, their frames hung slightly tilted, and all of them were smiling, not warmly, not kindly. Their mouths had grown wider, too wide. In the first portrait, Uncle Hollis, dead at sea, his teeth were longer than she remembered. In the next, Cousin Willa, choked on broth, her eyes had turned a full black like beetle glass. Lucinda walked faster. She did not run. That would make it real. The house does not chase unless you flee. She had learned that young, but something had changed since the last guest. She passed the sitting room and noticed the lamp had been lit, the fireplace too, but no one had entered this room in years, no footprints, no open doors, and on the velvet armchair sat a figure, still upright, wrapped in gauze, its head slowly turned. Only there was no head, not really, just bone beneath cloth, thin strings of hair, and something twitching behind the eyes, like a wet dog shivering inside a sack. Lucinda turned away, and something touched her back. Not a hand, something colder, wider. It didn't grab, not yet. It merely rested there. Like a reminder, like someone letting you know they're close enough to take you if they want. And then it breathed. The next morning, the house was different. Not visibly. No walls had moved, no floors collapsed, but the corridors. They no longer led where they once had. Lucinda opened the door to her father's study and found the garden. She opened the pantry and found a long hallway lined with lanterns, all of them already lit. She opened her bedroom and saw herself, younger, standing, in the same gown she buried her sister in, holding hands with a man whose face was turned to ash mid-smile, and when the door shut, it did so by itself. In the basement, the coffins had closed. All of them. Every one. Except one. The one meant for her. Lucinda saw her name in fresh chalk, but it wasn't her name. It was her signature, written by her own hand. The date matched that morning, and something had already lain. Inside, there were indentations in the linen. A few strands of white blonde hair curled at the center like a sleeping spider. She felt the air move behind her. No footsteps, no breath, just a shift, like gravity nudging its own shoulder. Then, a whisper, not a word, just the shape of one. She turned and saw nothing, but her wrist hurt. She looked down. Finger marks, 5 of them. Red, already bruising, but cold, still damp, like hands pulled from the earth. She did not scream, because she knew screaming would only make it jealous. Later, she found herself sitting at the dining table. Someone had served supper, cornbread, collards, a thin meat stew that still steamed. Across the table sat a child, maybe 5 years old, maybe a boy, maybe not. Its mouth moved, but the sound came from the walls, not speech. Names, old ones, buried ones, guests who should have never left the ground. Lucinda picked up her spoon and began to eat, because she knew what came next if she didn't. The grabbing, the holding, the voice telling her over and over, "This is love! This is what you wanted. You brought them here." And maybe she had. She had no way to be sure anymore, because some of the guests had her eyes, some wore her dress, and one had already started using her voice. Lucinda awoke standing, not in her bed, not in the coffin, but on the edge of the orchard, in her nightdress, barefoot and cold, a trowel in her hand, dirt beneath her nails, and a child's shoe half buried in the soil beside her. She didn't remember walking there. She didn't remember digging, but the hole at her feet was the size of a person, not large, small, and freshly dug. When she turned to run, she couldn't, not for lack of will. Her legs simply didn't move the way they should. They bent wrong, as if they remembered a different body than hers. That's when she saw her reflection. In the black window of the barn, it smiled. She did not. It waved. She did not. Then it mouthed something. 3 words, not a curse, a promise. You're already here. Back in the house, time stopped trying to behave. The clocks had melted. No, not melted, changed. All of them now ticked backwards. The grandfather clock in the hall ran its pendulum in slow, heaving arcs like something struggling against a rope. Each time it swung, the shadows behind it grew fainter, but the faces within them became clearer. Lucinda opened the linen cupboard and found herself dead, peaceful, laid out on clean sheets as if she were her own guest, with flowers in her hands. But it wasn't a trick of the eye. She was cold, and her arms were beginning to move. In the guest rooms, the remaining guests were silent, not asleep, not dead, just quiet, wrapped in gauze, each laid out on their beds with eyes open, breathing barely. One blinked, only once. Lucinda tried to speak to her, a girl named Grace, who had arrived 2 weeks before and never spoken a word. Grace blinked again. Her lips moved, soundless. Lucinda leaned close and heard the faint whisper, so dry it cracked the air. "You're not you anymore." Lucinda recoiled, but her hand reached forward, on its own, to touch Grace's cheek, a gentle touch, almost maternal, and Grace smiled, not at Lucinda, at whatever controlled her hand. That night the portraits wept, not blood, not water, but thin, white strings, like silk. They draped from their eyes and mouths and hung to the floor, twitching in the candlelight. When Lucinda tried to cut one, it grabbed her wrist, tight, then relaxed, as if to say, "Not yet." She stared at the strand. It pulsed, not with light, with breath. She began to follow them, trailing room to room, each one connected to something: a mirror, a doorknob, a shoe left beneath, a bed, a mouth, one mouth still breathing beneath the floorboards. She returned to the cellar. The coffins were all open again, except one. Now it was nailed shut. The chalk had been replaced. The name now said, Lucinda Evelyn, Ashwood Burke, beloved daughter, gentle host, forever patient. There was no date, only one word in red. Returned. Lucinda touched the lid, and her hand disappeared. Not entirely, just beyond the wrist, like she had pushed it through glass. But it felt like skin. It felt like reaching, beneath warm flesh, and something beneath gripped her fingers, softly, then tightly, then harder, like someone was trying to remind her how to pray. She yanked it free, bled for hours, but the handprint stayed. It showed through gloves. It ached in moonlight, and at night, when she closed her eyes, she could feel a second heartbeat. Not her own. Lower in her chest, like something had curled inside her ribcage and built a home. She tried to leave the house. She walked past the garden, the pond, the fields. She followed the lanterns. She passed the gate. She walked 3 days and returned to the front porch. Time meant nothing. Direction meant nothing. And when she looked down at her feet, she saw soil, fresh, loose, and a child's shoe in her hand. Lucinda did not dream anymore. Dreams require separation, a before and after. She now existed in a place where every moment bled into the next, like candle wax melting into water. There was no day or night in Ashwood, only breath, and not all of it was hers. Her reflection had grown kinder, more composed. It wore her face better than she did. It didn't flinch when the walls whispered or when the chairs moved on their own. It didn't shudder when the floor breathed beneath her, slow and patient, like the inn had lungs the size of its foundation. She began to sleep in different beds each night, not by choice. She would wake up already tucked in, sometimes in rooms she didn't recognize, sometimes beside someone, sometimes inside a coffin she had not climbed into, and once beside Grace. But Grace was no longer Grace. She was something gentler now, something motherly, and her eyes shone with the knowledge that Lucinda would understand soon. One night, Lucinda walked the halls and smelled bread, freshly baked. No kitchen had been lit in weeks. She followed the smell, barefoot, silent. It led her to a room she had never seen, even though it was always there. The nursery, dozens of tiny cribs, empty, but warm. Each one rocked gently on its own, and the walls had murals of trees that moved when you didn't look at them directly. At the center of the room, a chair faced away from her, a high-backed wooden chair, rocking. A figure sat in it, slender hands, a blue dress, gray hair pulled tightly back. Lucinda felt the handprint on her arm throb. She stepped closer. The woman in the chair was her, older, gentler, smiling, and knitting. Tiny shoes, one by one. Lucinda ran. She tried, but each step was treacle. The hall stretched longer. The wood beneath her softened until it felt like flesh, until it held her. Not hard, not harsh, just held, like a lover, like a grave. When she fell, the floor caught her. The walls shuddered. Not with menace, with joy. It wanted her to rest. It wanted her to stay. The portraits smiled. The clock stopped. The names on the chalkboards erased themselves, and she knew she had never been a guest. She had been chosen. The next time she opened her eyes, she was hosting dinner. 7 chairs, 7 guests, all smiling politely, all with dirt beneath their nails. She recognized no one, and yet she knew them all. One man whispered, "We've missed you, Lucinda." Another nodded. "You cook better now." A woman with no mouth raised her glass. Her hand trembled, and so did Lucinda's. The handprint on her forearm glowed faintly in the candlelight. Each guest wore one, just in a different place. A sign of, membership, of return. Later in the garden, she buried something. She didn't know what, but it was small, wrapped tightly, and warm. She never opened the cloth, not once. She just smiled, kissed it, and whispered, "You're home now." She didn't dig the grave. The earth opened for her, softly, hungrily, like it had missed her. She laid the bundle inside, pressed the soil down with her palm, felt it pulse back, and wept, not from grief, from belonging. At night, the house sang to her, low hum, like wind through piano strings. She hummed back. Each note brought a memory, not hers, but someone's. A child's laugh, a scream swallowed by water, the sound of shoes on wooden stairs, wet with soil, the names of people she had never met and now missed with her whole heart. In the cellar, the coffins had changed. They were now cradles, each with a name, each gently rocking, none of them empty. Some of them opened their eyes when she passed. None cried, all smiled. By the time morning came, though morning didn't really exist, Lucinda had become part of the house. She couldn't remember what her life had been before, but she didn't feel lost. She felt loved. Utterly, impossibly, endlessly loved. And the next time someone knocked at Ashwood's door, a traveler, wet from the storm, desperate for shelter, Lucinda answered, with open arms, with a smile, and a gentle voice that said, "You must be tired. Please, come rest." The estate had new rooms to fill. The dirt had already stirred. There was a night when a new guest knocked on Ashwood's tall, rotted door. The handle turned without anyone touching it. The hinges moaned like something remembering a former shape. Rain pelted the porch in ribbons, and a tall man stood there, clutching his coat, boots soaked through, eyes wary, the way all first-time guests looked. He wasn't running from anything. Not really, just tired, looking for shelter, a warm place, a bit of dry food, a dry bed, maybe the sound of voices. He'd seen the flickering lanterns through the woods. He followed them like stars. He never questioned that someone had been expecting him, and someone had. Lucinda. She opened the door, but she didn't wear her name anymore. She wore the house. She was the house. Her eyes were not eyes. They were windows. Into memory. Into grave dirt. Into the silence that follows breath but comes before death. Her mouth was warm, her voice inviting, her arms thin but steady. "Come in," she said. "We've prepared a place for you." Behind her, the foyer sighed. It did that sometimes, especially when it was pleased. The man stepped across the threshold, and in that moment, he was no longer a man. Not in the way you and I understand it. He became Ashwood's newest heartbeat. That night, 7 other guests sat at the long table. They smiled gently. They didn't eat. They didn't speak. Some of them blinked in unison. All of them had dirt under their nails. Their breath came slowly, as if every inhale had to be asked for. Lucinda brought the food, or what looked like food. The man, the new guest, ate hungrily, never asking where it came from. He didn't hear the scratching in the walls, didn't feel the warmth beneath the floorboards, didn't notice how the curtains closed on their own. He only noticed Lucinda and how familiar she felt. When he finally slept, He didn't dream. The house took care of that. Dreams meant remembering, and Ashwood did not want you to remember. It only wanted you to belong. And so, in the dead center of the house, below the cellar, below the floor lined with chalk names and wet roots, the coffins rocked. 7 of them, always 7, even as guests came and left, but never left. The coffins were not for the dead. They were for those who'd forgotten they weren't dead yet. In the morning, though it's been many years since Ashwood knew true mourning, Lucinda opened a new door. This one was inside. It had not been there yesterday, or maybe it had. Time didn't apply to Ashwood in a linear sense. Behind the door was a nursery, not for child,